The rain came in sideways that afternoon, thin and persistent, the kind that doesn't soak you all at once but accumulates until you realize your collar is wet and your shoes have been ruined for 20 minutes without your noticing. Eleanor Hayes had noticed. She noticed everything. She stood at the iron gate of Laurelhurst Memorial, her black umbrella tilted at precisely the angle required to keep the mist off her coat without impeding her sightlines. Her driver, Marcus, had offered to walk with her, as he always did, and she had declined, as she always did. He would wait by the car. That was the arrangement. Everything at Laurelhurst moved on an arrangement. She came every third Friday. Not every Friday that would have been grief, not once a month that would have been duty performed at arm's length. Every third Friday was the frequency Eleanor had determined struck the correct balance between memory and function. She had been doing this for 7 years, since her father, Charles Hayes, had died of a cardiac event in his home study at the age of 71. She had been 34. She was 41 now. The math was easy. The rest was not. The path to plot C14 was 112 steps from the gate along the eastern gravel walk. Eleanor knew because she had counted once, on a visit, when her mind needed an anchor. The number had stuck. Now she counted without trying, the way the body learns anything it does often enough. She was 87 steps in when she saw him, a man, standing at her father's grave. She slowed. She did not stop. Stopping would have been a declaration of something, but she shortened her stride until she was moving at a pace that gave her time to observe. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a year or two on either side. Work clothes, dark canvas trousers, a gray institutional jacket with a small logo on the left breast she couldn't read from this distance. The jacket was the kind that came in bulk orders, that didn't belong to the person wearing it so much as to whoever issued it. His dark hair was damp and beginning to curl at the collar. He was not holding an umbrella. He was not holding flowers, either, which Eleanor registered as unusual. People who came to graves usually brought something, an offering, however small. This man had come with nothing, or nothing visible, which meant he had come with himself, just himself, standing in the rain, facing the gray granite marker that read, Charles Raymond Hayes, Itenjo by Sisharar, Launsenling he should see. He was thorough in all things. Eleanor had chosen that epitaph. Her mother had wanted beloved father and husband. Eleanor had argued for accuracy over sentiment. She had won that argument and later, much later, in the particular silence of certain nights, had wondered whether winning it had been the correct choice. She stopped 12 feet back. The man's shoulders were moving. Not much, just enough. He was crying, not performing grief, not producing tears for an audience. There was no audience, he believed. This was the involuntary kind. The kind that arrives when the body has been holding something too long and the pressure finally exceeds the container. His right hand came up slowly and pressed against the face of the stone. Palm flat, the way a person touches the shoulder of someone they are trying to reassure. Eleanor stood in the rain and watched a stranger grieve at her father's grave with more visible feeling than she had managed in 7 years of Third Fridays. She heard him speak. Low, almost inaudible under the rain. I wouldn't be alive without you, sir. I need you to know that. The words arrived with the specific weight of things said to people who can no longer respond. Confession without consequence. Gratitude without witness. Eleanor stood very still. Something moved in her chest that she did not immediately identify, because it had been a long time since she'd felt it, and she had gotten very good at moving past the moments when it threatened to surface. She cleared her throat. The man flinched and turned. He was younger looking face on than from behind. Not dramatically younger, still somewhere in his early 40s, but the eyes were the eyes of someone who had been very tired for a long time and had recently, gradually, become less so. Brown eyes, reddened now at the rims. A jaw that hadn't been shaved in 2 or 3 days, not from carelessness, but from the particular busyness of a life that didn't have much margin. He said, I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was. Who are you? Eleanor asked. The directness landed the way it always did. A small flinch, a recalibration. People expected preamble. She had stopped providing it years ago because preamble cost time and rarely produced better information. My name is Daniel Brooks. He took a half step back from the grave, as though vacating property he had been occupying without permission. I work at the cemetery. Grounds. This wasn't work time. He stopped, looked at the stone, looked back at her. Are you a family member? I'm his daughter. Something moved through his expression that she catalogued but couldn't yet classify. Not guilt, not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recognition, as though a piece of information had just arrived that confirmed something he had long suspected might happen. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, which was the correct phrase. But he said it as though he meant it, which was less common. You were crying, Eleanor said, at my father's grave. You didn't know him. It was not quite a question. He answered it as though it were. I did, actually. Not well. Not for long. But I knew him. He paused. We met once. It was a significant meeting. Eleanor studied him. She was practiced at the assessment of people. She had been doing it in boardrooms and across negotiating tables for the better part of 2 decades. And what she observed in Daniel Brooks was a person who was not comfortable lying and therefore did not attempt it. His discomfort was purely situational. He had been found doing something private, and the person who found him had a claim to the space he had been inhabiting. That was all. When? She asked. About 10 years ago. Maybe 11. He seemed to do the math in his head. Closer to 11. Where? The Pike Place area. Downtown. He hesitated. I was living on the streets at the time. Eleanor kept her expression neutral. She was aware of the reflex, the default skepticism that arose whenever a stranger at a cemetery presented a story that began with hardship, and she watched it arrive in herself without letting it govern her response. Not yet. How did you know to find him here? She asked. I didn't, initially. He looked down at the grave again, briefly, with an expression that was not performance. I looked him up a few years after, when things had settled down enough that I could think about it. It took me a while to find the right Charles Hayes. There are more of them than you'd think. A ghost of something crossed his face. When I found out he'd died, I wanted to. He stopped. I'm not sure exactly why I started coming. It seemed like the right thing. Eleanor said nothing. Daniel Brooks turned the collar of his jacket up against the rain in a gesture that was purely practical and unself-conscious. She noted that he had not asked her for anything, had not positioned the story in a way that implied a forthcoming request. He was not warming her up. He was simply standing there, in the rain at his dead acquaintance's grave, talking to the dead man's daughter because she had asked him to. She said, "What did he do?" "When you met," Daniel looked at her for a moment. "He didn't give me money," he said. If that's what you're asking, it was not what she had been asking, but it was the answer to the question she had been forming without articulating it, and the fact that he'd identified and addressed it without prompting required a small internal revision of her initial read. He sat down with me, Daniel said, on a bench, for about 7 minutes, and he talked to me like I was a person. Eleanor kept her expression very still. I know that probably sounds small, he added. She said, my father wasn't generally known for sitting on benches. No. Daniel almost smiled, and the almost smile was the first fully unguarded thing she had seen from him. He seemed like a man who was always on his way somewhere. But he stopped. There was something in the way he said it, he stopped, that carried more meaning than the 2 words contained on their surface. Eleanor was silent for 3 seconds. 4. You said something specific, she said. Just now. Before I spoke, you said you wouldn't be alive without him. Daniel met her eyes. He did not look away, which she noted. Yes, he said. That's accurate. She studied him. I'll need more than that, she said. I know, he exhaled. I just not here. Not right now, if that's all right. I come on Fridays. If you come on Fridays too, He stopped. I'm sorry, that's presumptuous. Every third Friday, she said. She wasn't entirely sure why she said it. He nodded once. Okay, he said. Every third Friday, then. He turned and walked back toward the groundskeeper's shed along the north wall, his jacket collar still up, his hands in his pockets. He did not look back. Eleanor stood for a long moment in the rain. Then she turned to her father's grave and looked at the stone. And for the first time in 7 years of Third Fridays, she felt that she was looking at something she had perhaps never fully seen. She told herself, on the drive home, that she would not think about it. She thought about it for 4 days. Not obsessively, she had a company to run. A board presentation on Thursday. 2 acquisition conversations that required her full attention. But it was there, at the edges of things. A thread she had identified and not yet followed, which was unusual because Eleanor's professional habit was to follow all threads immediately. To prefer knowing to not knowing, even when knowing was uncomfortable. The discomfort, she suspected, was the issue. It wasn't Daniel Brooks she was thinking about, precisely. It was the mismatch. She had a clear internal image of her father. A precise man, an organized man, a man who kept his schedule in a leather-bound planner. He replaced each January and archived each December in sequential order in his study. He had been warm in the specific way of men who had been raised to contain warmth that came through in practical gestures, in arriving exactly when he said he would, in remembering the names of people's children. He had not been cold, but he had not been demonstrative. He had built things. He had run companies. He had done philanthropy through proper channels, through the Hayes Family Foundation, with staff and reporting structures and approved grant applications. He sat down with me. For about 7 minutes, he talked to me like I was a person. That wasn't the father she knew. Or rather, it wasn't the father she had a record of. She called Walter Price on a Tuesday evening. Walter was 76, had been her father's attorney for 30 years, and was the kind of man whose loyalty to a client did not expire at the client's death. He was precise and careful and had always treated Eleanor with the particular combination of deference and protectiveness that older men sometimes offered women who had clearly surpassed all expectations set for them. "Walter," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want your honest answer, not the answer you think I want." "Eleanor," he said, in the slightly pained tone that meant he already suspected the question would be difficult. "Were there charitable activities my father engaged in that weren't run through the foundation?" A pause. "Define charitable," Walter said. "Informal, personal, off-record." Another pause. "Longer? Why do you ask?" "Answer the question, Walter." He was quiet for long enough that she moved to her window and looked out at the city lights and waited. "Your father was a private man," Walter said finally. "In certain respects, more private than even you knew. There were things he did privately. I'm not in a position to characterize them fully, because he was explicit that they remained confidential." Eleanor kept her voice even. "He's dead, Walter. I know. The confidentiality agreement is a matter of his wishes, which I still feel obligated to honor. A beat. But I can tell you this much, Eleanor. The way you found out about whatever you found out about, I'm not surprised." He was always somewhat surprised, himself, that more hadn't come to light. She said, "How many people are we talking about?" Walter was quiet for a moment. "I genuinely don't know," he said. "I wasn't involved in most of it. He didn't want anyone involved. That was rather the point." Eleanor thanked him and ended the call. She stood at the window for a while. The city continued below her, indifferent, and she looked at it with the particular feeling of a person who has just discovered that a room they thought they knew completely has a door they somehow never noticed. She employed 3 people in what she privately called her information office, a discreet research team whose official title was Strategic Intelligence, whose work covered competitive analysis, acquisition targets, background checks. They were very good. They had never told her something was unfindable when it was findable. She asked them, on a Wednesday, to pull everything they could on the 5 years before her father's death. His calendar, his travel records, his personal expenditures from accounts that weren't tied to the foundation. They came back on Friday morning with a folder. There were gaps. Not many. Her father had been meticulous, but there were recurring gaps. Tuesday afternoons, occasional Saturday mornings. The entries in his planner for those periods were sparse. Initials only, no location. Some years the initials repeated. Some years they changed. She recognized none of them. She drove herself to the address Walter had referenced obliquely in a second conversation, a small non-profit on the east side of the city she'd found through a cross-reference in her father's personal account records. A transfer, modest by her father's standards, to an organization called Meridian Transitions. No explanation, no grant application on file with the foundation. The office occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building near 23rd Avenue. A handwritten sign on the door said they were open Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and Saturday mornings. She walked in on a Saturday. The woman at the desk was somewhere in her mid-60s, with close-cropped silver hair and the practical competence of someone who had run small organizations on insufficient budgets for decades. She looked up without particular deference. "Can I help you? I'm looking for information about a donor," Eleanor said. "My father." His name was Charles Hayes. The woman's expression shifted not dramatically, but measurably. Something in the eyes. "Let me get Patricia," she said. Patricia was the executive director, a tall woman in her early 70s who had presumably been there a long time and had seen most things. She shook Eleanor's hand with the deliberate firmness of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by credentials and was instead interested in people. "Mr. Hayes," Patricia said, when they were seated in a small office that smelled of coffee and old paper. "How well?" "Fairly well. Over time. He was involved with us for," she thought about it, "perhaps 12 years. Off and on. 12 years. Eleanor calculated. He had started when she was in her late 20s, building her own company, barely surfacing for air. "In what capacity?" she asked. "As a volunteer, initially. Then as a quiet donor." Patricia folded her hands on the desk. He was emphatic, every time we discussed it, that his involvement not be publicized. No naming opportunities. No press. He didn't want to be approached because of it. "What kind of work does the organization do?" "We work with people in transitional situations, housing instability, re-entry, people who've had significant life disruptions." Patricia watched Eleanor carefully. "He didn't just write checks, Miss Hayes. He came in on Tuesday afternoons and sat with people. Sometimes he referred individuals to us, people he'd encountered. He had an instinct for finding them." Eleanor said. "An instinct for seeing them, I think, is more accurate." Patricia paused. "We have people in this city who are invisible. They learn, very quickly, that most people look through them. Your father didn't. He looked at people." She paused again, and he remembered them. Not as cases, not as files. He would ask about someone's daughter by name 3 months after meeting them once. He sent birthday cards, not from the foundation, from himself. Just a note in his handwriting. People here still have those cards. Eleanor said nothing. She was thinking about her father's handwriting, which she had not seen in 7 years. "I'm telling you this because I think you came here to know something real, not to receive a plaque or a summary, and because he's gone, and the people he helped are real, and someone should carry that knowledge." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. "He never told me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was barely a statement. It was more like a thing falling. "No," Patricia said gently. "He said once, I remember this specifically, he said that if the people he was close to knew, it would change what it was. He didn't want it to be part of his image. He wanted it to be real." Eleanor looked at the wall. There was a bulletin board with photographs. People in chairs. people in groups, people outside, in front of buildings, holding papers. He didn't want anyone to know, she said. Patricia said. He wanted the people he helped to know. That was all. She was early on the third Friday. By 40 minutes, which was not her habit. She stood near the gate and watched the groundskeeper's shed until she saw him come out, a leaf blower in one hand, a pair of work gloves in the other. He saw her immediately, set down the equipment, walked over. "You're early," he said, apparently. She started toward plot C14. He fell into step beside her, which she hadn't explicitly invited and didn't object to. The rain was lighter today, barely there. The kind that existed more as atmosphere than precipitation. The cemetery smelled of fallen leaves and damp stone, which was not an unpleasant smell, only an honest one. "I did some research," Eleanor said. "I expected you might." He was involved with a non-profit called Meridian Transitions. Daniel nodded. He didn't seem surprised. "That's where he sent me, after." "After what?" They had reached the grave. They both stopped and stood in front of it with the particular stillness of people who have arranged themselves around a shared center of gravity. "After the bench," he said. "After he sat with me." He looked at the stone. "He didn't find me through the organization. I was sitting behind a dumpster on Western Avenue, and he was walking past, and he stopped. I don't know why he stopped. People walk past that kind of thing every day without stopping, and he probably had, too, in his life. But that day, he stopped." Eleanor looked at the headstone. "I want to tell you," Daniel said, "that I was in a bad state. Not just materially. I'd lost my wife 18 months before. She had a brain hemorrhage. Very fast. She was 31. I had a 2-year-old daughter and no money and no support. And I had come, over those 18 months, to a place where I wasn't sure I wanted to keep going." He said this matter-of-factly, not for effect. "I wasn't planning anything specific. The will to continue had gotten very thin." Eleanor said nothing. "He sat down on the curb," Daniel said, "which I remember because I thought a man in a coat like that, sitting on a Seattle curb next to someone like me." He didn't introduce himself at first. He just sat there, for a minute, and then he said, "You look like you're carrying something heavy. I have a few minutes if you want company." "A few minutes? I have a few minutes." "And I talked to him," Daniel said. "I don't remember everything I said. I told him about my wife, about my daughter. She was with my mother-in-law at the time. I wasn't in a condition to be caring for her." He listened. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't give me pamphlets or phone numbers. He just listened, and then he said. He paused. He said, "Your daughter needs you to stay in the world. Not the you that you are right now, necessarily, but the you that's still in there." And then he said, "Would you be willing to try?" And I said yes. Eleanor had placed her hands behind her back. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. He gave me a card for Meridian. He paid for a room for me that night, not with his name, through the organization. By the next week, I was in temporary housing. Within a year, I had a job. He glanced at his jacket. Different jobs, over time. This one I've had for 4 years. My daughter is 13 now. A pause. She's the best thing. She plays violin. She's funny. She tells me when I need a haircut. Eleanor looked at the stone for a long moment. He said one more thing, Daniel said, at the bench. Before he left, he said, "You've been invisible long enough. You're seen now." And then he got up and walked away. "You're seen now." Eleanor stood very still in the rain that was barely rain. In front of the stone she had visited 38 times in 7 years and understood for the first time that she had been visiting a grave without knowing whose grave it was. She had known her father's achievements, his company, his investments, his foundation grants, his quarterly reviews, his preferred whiskey, his reading habits, his opinion of certain politicians. She had not known this. "I need to go," she said. Her voice was level. It cost her something to keep it level, but she kept it level. "Of course," Daniel said. She walked back toward the gate. Marcus was waiting by the car. He opened the door and she got in, and he pulled out of the lot, and she sat in the back seat and looked at the wet street and did not say anything for the entire 40-minute drive home. There is a specific quality to grief that is not grief for a death, but grief for a version of a person you never knew was there. It lacks the clean edges of mourning. It doesn't arrive in waves or stages. It arrives sideways, in quiet moments, when you are doing something else entirely, reading a contract, eating breakfast, watching rain against glass, and it sits with you not as pain, exactly, but as a kind of retroactive missing. Eleanor recognized it without naming it, because she had always found naming emotions less useful than observing them. She sat in her home office on Saturday morning with coffee she didn't drink and a view of the sound she didn't see, and she ran the arithmetic. 12 years of Tuesday afternoons. 52 Tuesdays a year, minus holidays, minus travel. 300, perhaps, over the course of those 12 years. 300 afternoons she had known nothing about. She had thought he was working. He might have been. Some of those days. But some of those days who knew how many he had been at a table in a small non-profit on 23rd Avenue, or on a bench on Western Avenue, or sitting with someone in a way that changed what was possible for them. She thought about how she had spent her own Tuesday afternoons over the past 12 years. She thought about her assistant, Gretchen, who had worked for her for 9 years and whose mother had died in March. And Eleanor had sent flowers, which was the correct gesture, the gesture that fell within the protocol she had developed for managing human relationships at scale. And she had not asked Gretchen how she was doing in any particular depth, because that was not, she had told herself that was not what their relationship was. She thought about her driver Marcus, who had a son with a chronic illness. She knew this because it was in his background file, which she reviewed annually, and she had never asked him about it. Not once. Not because she didn't care, she told herself now, but because caring at that level required a kind of presence she had never practiced, had never thought to practice. Her father had built a company larger than hers, had sat on more boards, flown more miles, made more decisions of greater consequence than most people encountered in a lifetime. He had not been soft. He had not been without edge. He had been, by all external measures, a man of substantial power and full schedule, and he had found or made the time to sit on a bench for 7 minutes with a stranger who needed to be seen. Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. The money she had donated over the years was substantial. The foundation operated efficiently. The grants were well structured and properly monitored. She had never doubted that she was contributing meaningfully to the world. The annual reports were solid. The metrics were strong. A consulting firm had evaluated the foundation's impact delivery as best in class for an organization of its size and scope. She understood now, doing all of it from a very great distance. There was a word for what she had been doing. The word was management. She had been managing generosity the way she managed everything else, with rigor, with oversight, at a careful remove that preserved the system's efficiency. She had designed it so that no single person's need would ever require her direct presence. It scaled. It was defensible in any room. It was, in every operational sense, excellent. It was nothing like sitting on a curb. She stood and went to the window and looked at the sound for a long time. She thought about all the things her father had done that would never appear in any impact report. She thought about what it meant to live in the gap between what was measured and what was real. She had spent her entire adult life making things visible, naming buildings, launching campaigns, hosting galas, generating coverage because she had understood, at some cellular level, that visibility was the proof. If it wasn't documented, how did you know it happened? How did you know it counted? She was beginning to understand, slowly and with some resistance, that the question itself had been the problem, that the need for proof had been, all along, the distance. She thought about Daniel Brooks's daughter, 13 years old, playing violin, telling her father when he needed a haircut, Alive in the world in the specific way that required her father to also be alive in the world. Alive because a man in a good coat had sat down on a curb on a Tuesday and been present for 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Who was he? She thought. When I wasn't looking, she sat with that question until the coffee was cold and the light had shifted, and Marcus texted to ask if she needed him today. She texted back that she didn't. She sat a while longer. Then, she opened her contacts and found Daniel Brooks's number. She had asked for it before she left the cemetery, with the same efficiency she asked for any information she might need later, and she sent him a message. There are other people, from Meridian or otherwise. Do you know any of them? He replied 40 minutes later. A few. Not many. He was careful about privacy. She looked at the message for a moment. Would you be willing to introduce me? Another pause. Then, yes. Though I should warn you they're not impressive on paper. Most of them aren't. That was kind of the point. She read this twice. I understand, she wrote back. That's why I'm asking. The first person Daniel introduced her to was a woman named Sandra Voigt, 52, who ran a small alterations shop in the Central District. She had met Charles Hayes when she was coming out of a long period of addiction and had attended one of Meridian's workshops where he had happened to be volunteering. They had talked for 20 minutes. He had asked her what she had been good at before everything fell apart. She had said sewing. He had asked if she would be willing to try again. He had connected her with a woman who owned a dry cleaner who needed alterations work. That had been 15 years ago. The shop had been open for 11. Sandra told Eleanor this over tea in the back of the shop, surrounded by racks of other people's clothing waiting to be made right. She was not sentimental about it. She was matter-of-fact in the way of people who have traveled hard roads and come out with a clear understanding of what was useful and what was not. He wasn't charming, Sandra said. I want to be accurate about that. He wasn't the kind of person who made you feel good about yourself by telling you you were special. He was the kind of person who took you seriously, which is different. She threaded a needle without looking at it, the way a musician plays a scale. Most people who try to help you are doing it in a way that keeps you below them. He didn't do that. Eleanor sat with her tea and listened. She had always been good at talking. She was, by now, less practiced at listening, actually listening, in the way that required her to turn off the part of her mind that was already formulating the next question, already sorting the information she was receiving into the bins of useful and not useful. That was how she had always listened. Efficiently, processingly. She tried to turn that off. It was harder than she had expected. 20 years of sitting across tables from people while simultaneously calculating their leverage, their motivations, the gap between what they were saying and what they wanted, that kind of listening did not switch off cleanly. It had grooves in her. It was the shape her attention defaulted to when it wasn't otherwise directed. She noticed herself doing it with Sandra. She noticed herself listening for the angle, for the implicit ask, for the thing that would tell her what this conversation was actually for. There was no angle. Sandra was simply telling her what had happened, accurately, without subtext. Eleanor caught herself waiting for the subtext and then, with some effort, stopped waiting. She tried again. She looked at Sandra's hands, the needle moving without thought. The practiced ease of someone who had spent years rebuilding a skill they had nearly lost. 11 years of alterations and repairs. Invisible work that kept other people's things whole. She heard what Sandra was saying, and she let it be what it was. And she did not file it or categorize it or move it toward any conclusion. It felt, strangely, like setting something down. Sandra thought about it. He said, "You're still here. That's not nothing. That's the whole thing." Eleanor set her cup down. He had a gift, Sandra said, for making ordinary survival feel like something worth building on. Not celebrating it falsely, just recognizing it as real. Eleanor drove herself home that evening. She had started driving herself places, which was new, because being alone in a car with her own thoughts was something she had recently decided she needed more of rather than less of. And she thought about what Sandra had said. She thought about what it meant to take people seriously. She thought about Gretchen, who had been back at work for 3 months since her mother died, who had been doing her job with the same precision as always, which Eleanor had registered as competent and dependable, and had perhaps been, actually, stoic courage, which was a different thing entirely. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the office 9 minutes earlier than usual. Gretchen was already there, as she always was. Eleanor said, "How are you doing?" With "How are you actually doing?" Gretchen looked up from her screen. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds that contained considerable information. "I'm Gretchen," started, and then stopped, and then looked at Eleanor with an expression that was measuring something. "I'm okay some days, and not great other days. The not great days are easier than they used to be." Eleanor said, "I'm glad you're here." She meant it. She was aware that it was a small thing to say. She was also aware that she had never said it in 9 years, and that small things said truthfully and without agenda landed differently than large things said correctly. Gretchen said, "Thank you." And then, after a beat, "That actually helps." She established the fund in her father's name and then, a week later, took his name off it. She thought he would have preferred that. She structured it through Meridian, with Patricia as the oversight director, and she set it up to operate exactly the way her father had operated. Small, direct, invisible, money for rooms, for tools, for first month's rent, for the particular material gaps that people in transitional situations fell into and could not climb out of alone. No announcements, no press release. She told Marcus, who she had started having actual conversations with during drives, his son's condition was being managed better now. There were new treatments, he was playing soccer again, and she told Gretchen, who cried briefly and professionally, and said your father would be glad, which was a thing Eleanor had not known she needed to hear until she heard it. She started going to Meridian on Tuesday afternoons, not to give speeches, not to tour the facilities or review the programming or sit in a donor chair at the head of a table. She came in and sat at the tables where the regular volunteers sat, and she talked to people. She was bad at it, initially. Her instinct was to solve, to advise, to identify the actionable step. She caught herself doing it. She corrected for it, imperfectly, and caught herself doing it again, and corrected again. Learning, in her experience, was always repetitive before it became automatic. She met a man named Terrence, who was 58 and had recently been released after 11 years, and who wanted, more than anything, to find his daughter, who would be 26 now, and who he had not spoken to since she was 15. He was not asking Eleanor for money or connections or any of the things she could have provided easily. He was asking her to just hear that it was heavy, that carrying it was hard. She heard it. She did not offer to fix it. She said, "That sounds like a long time to carry something that important." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "It is." They sat in silence for a moment that was not uncomfortable. She understood, in that moment, what her father had understood and had spent 12 years practicing. That presence was a form of action, that the willingness to sit in someone else's reality without immediately trying to change it, without reaching for your tools, your resources, your catalog of solutions, was not passivity. It was the hardest kind of respect. Daniel came to meet her after one of those Tuesday sessions. He had his daughter with him, Lily, 13, with her father's brown eyes and the erect posture of someone who played a string instrument. She shook Eleanor's hand with the seriousness of a child who has been taught to take things seriously. "Dad talks about you," Lily said. "Good things, I hope," Eleanor said. Lily considered this with the specific diplomacy of a teenager. "He says, you're learning." Eleanor looked at Daniel, who was trying not to smile. "That's accurate," Eleanor said. To Daniel, "She's honest. It's occasionally inconvenient," he said, with the tone of a parent who does not mean this at all. They walked out together into the cooling afternoon, Lily slightly ahead, looking at something on the sidewalk with the complete absorption of a person who is 13 and fully inhabiting the present moment, and Eleanor watched her and thought about her father watching people, really watching them, not assessing them. Watching them, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time, not all the way down, but further than it had been. "You're doing it," Daniel said quietly, beside her. "You know that. The thing he did. You're doing it." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "I'm practicing." "So was he, once," Daniel said. "It's the same thing." The rain came in sideways that afternoon, thin and persistent. Eleanor stood at the iron gate of Laurelhurst Memorial and let it happen. She had left her umbrella in the car. Not as a gesture, not consciously, she had simply gotten out of the car and started walking, and realized, 30 yards in, that she hadn't taken it, and decided to keep going. The path to plot C14 was 112 steps. Daniel was already there. He was always there before her, these days, a fact that she had stopped noting as unusual and started registering as one of the reliable things. He had brought a small bunch of late-season marigolds, which he placed against the base of the stone with the care of someone performing a private ceremony. He stepped back to make room. They stood side by side in the October rain and looked at the stone. Charles Raymond dies. Itenjo by Sishar, Launsenling. He was thorough in all things. She had been looking at this epitaph for 7 years, and now, for the first time, she understood it correctly. He had been thorough, not in the managerial sense, not in the sense of dotting I's and managing systems. He had been thorough in his attention, thorough in his presence, thorough in his belief that what a person needed sometimes, not always, but sometimes at the most specific moments, was to be seen and to be told they were seen. That was what he had been thorough in. Eleanor hadn't written the epitaph wrong. She had simply not yet known how to read it. "I found another one," she said. Daniel looked at her sideways. Another person. She had been, over the past year, piecing together the edges of the map her father had never drawn. It was slow work. He had been deliberate about leaving no record. A woman named Agnes Whitfield. She runs a food program in Beacon Hill now. She said he found her at a bus stop in 2009. What did he do? He sat down next to her. Eleanor paused. She said she was crying, and he asked if she needed company. She said she didn't know. He said he had 10 minutes if she changed her mind. She looked at the stone. She changed her mind. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Bus stops and benches," he said. "Apparently, ordinary places." A silence settled between them, not empty, the kind that had content. Eleanor thought about the 10 people she had now found, 10 that she knew of, which was almost certainly a fraction of the actual number. She thought about the fact that her father had done this for 12 years, quietly, without record or recognition, and had died without telling anyone, including his own daughter. She thought about what it meant to do something real for 12 years, without needing it to be witnessed. She had been building things her entire adult life with the awareness that they would have her name on them. Not for vanity, she didn't think it was entirely vanity, but because the visibility was the evidence. If the world couldn't see it, how did you know it was real? She understood, now, the answer to that. You knew it was real because the person in front of you was real. Because Lily Brooks was 13 years old and played violin and corrected her father's haircut. Because Sandra Voigt's shop had been open for 11 years. Because Agnes Whitfield's food program served 400 people a week. Because Daniel Brooks had stood at a grave in the rain and said, "I wouldn't be alive without you," and meant it with his whole body. That was how you knew. A sound made her turn. 20 yards down the path, a young woman, perhaps 22, perhaps younger, was standing in front of a different grave, her arms wrapped around herself, not crying yet but close. Alone. The particular aloneness of someone who has come to a cemetery because there is no other place for what they are carrying. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. She felt, very clearly, the old reflex, the turn toward her phone, the mental categorization of the situation as outside her relevant scope, the practiced, not noticing, that was not cruelty but efficiency, the habit of a lifetime of moving through the world on a path she had already determined. She felt it arrive as cleanly as it always had. Her body still knew the move, still began to execute it. The difference was that now she could see it happening. She had spent a year learning to see herself doing things she had always done invisibly. Gretchen had told her once, carefully, that she seemed different lately, and Eleanor had asked in what way, and Gretchen had said, "More here." Eleanor had not known how to receive that. She had thanked her. She had thought about it for 3 days. She had eventually concluded that being here actually, presently, fully here, was a practice, not a state. You didn't achieve it. You kept choosing it. The same way you kept choosing to show up on third Fridays, even when you had other things to do. Even when it was raining, even when the accumulated weight of what you were learning made the simple act of standing at a grave feel enormous. She felt it arrive. She let it pass. Then, she looked at Daniel. He was watching her with an expression she had come to recognize, patient, not prompting, the face of a person who knew what was possible and was simply waiting to see what would be chosen. Eleanor turned back toward the young woman on the path. She stood very still for a moment. In the rain that was barely rain. In the cemetery, where her father had been thorough in all things. In the life that she was now, at last, beginning to understand she had inherited not the money, not the company, not the name on the foundation letterhead, but this, the knowledge that the most significant thing a person could do was to stop and sit and be present with another human being in a way that said, "I see you, and you are worth 7 minutes of my time," which is to say you are worth everything. She started down the path, not with a plan, not with an outcome predetermined, just walking, in the rain, toward someone who was alone. She did not know what she would say. Her father had not scripted these moments, she understood that now. He had simply stopped, and sat, and been present, and trusted that presence itself was something, that it was, in fact, the thing. She stopped a few feet away from the young woman. The woman looked up, brown eyes, reddened at the rims. Maybe 22. Maybe a little younger. The grave in front of her had flowers on it, recent ones, and a photograph in a small plastic sleeve, which told Eleanor that this was not the first visit, and that there was a ritual here, a careful one, the kind people build when they are trying to stay connected to something that is no longer reachable by ordinary means. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. The young woman looked at her for a moment, the wariness of a stranger being approached in a vulnerable moment. Eleanor said, "I come here too, every third Friday." She nodded toward plot C, 14 inches, the middle distance. "My father." Something in the young woman's posture shifted, slightly. The shoulders dropped a fraction. "Mine too," she said. "He's been here 2 years. I still can't." She stopped. "Some days are fine, and then a day like today just..." She stopped again. "Yes," Eleanor said. She did not offer a solution. She did not suggest grief counseling or silver linings, or the various well-meaning things people said in these moments to manage their own discomfort with someone else's pain. She said, "Yes, that's how it works." The young woman looked at her. "I have a few minutes," Eleanor said. "If you want company." Behind her, Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. They would continue to come, both of them, on third Fridays. The cemetery would continue to smell of leaves and wet stone. Lily Brooks would turn 14 in November and grow 2 inches and maintain her honest opinion of her father's haircut. Sandra Voigt would take on an apprentice at the shop. Agnes Whitfield's food program would expand to a second location. Gretchen would have a better year. Marcus's son would score his first goal of the season on a Saturday morning in March. Eleanor Hayes would not become a different person. She would become more fully the person she already was, which is the only meaningful change anyone ever makes. And every third Friday, she would stand in the rain at plot C14 and talk to a man she had known incompletely for 41 years. And she would say the things she had learned to say, which were simpler than the things she had said before, and more true. "I think I'm starting to understand," she said, once, quietly, to the stone. The rain answered the way rain answers consistently, without preference, falling on the living and the dead alike. It was enough.